in their periodic review of state parties. So it's getting more and more systematic in their approach to stress that parties should really put in place participatory and rights-based policy processes when implementing mitigation and adaptation action. And we see the result of participatory action here in the negotiating rooms. And that's why environmental, human rights, indigenous people organizations keep repeating how crucial participation is. The Action for Climate Empowerment process itself, I think it's a great example for the good and the bad part. We started negotiating the new work program a couple of years ago, and it was very hard to convince parties about the importance of framing ACE in human rights contexts and lenses, and that's why these arguments are so important. And last year, the lack of effective participation of civil society organizations actually led to a weak work program. We can say that it could have been more ambitious. If we look at it, the Glasgow Work Programme does not mention human rights, which is very difficult to accept, given that, as we have just established, public participation, access to information and education are human rights. But then we saw a big shift this year, because contrary to what happened last year, this time parties really took into consideration our concerns and remarks, and so made sure that observers were involved in the negotiating rooms really from day one, both during the formal negotiations, during informal informals, and really we engaged in a very constructive dialogue and let them understand why human rights is important in the context of this. And that led eventually to an action plan that does reference to human rights. It does reflect human rights in the preamble, but also in one of the deliverables. That's pretty important because it really can guide parties when implementing the action plan at the national level to take into account the elements of ACE, not just by looking at best practices, but really implementing structural changes. That's really the added value of framing everything within a human rights context, because it means that state parties need to create an enabling environment that promotes effectively public participation, access to information, environmental education that brings about effective change. And with the deliverable that we have in the action plan, the Secretariat will have to look at some of the good practices in implementation at the national level and include them in their annual reports. So that's going to be reflected more and more. What is good about ACE is not just about implementation at the national level, but also how constituted bodies and different work streams within the UNFCCC interact. There are going to be activities that really encourage different constituted bodies to report on ACE activities, to dialogue with each other. And we've seen, for instance, in other work streams how crucial public participation is. If we think about Article 6, market mechanism and approaches, participation is essential in the context of projects that are going to be implemented and really need to follow very strong rules about public participation, free and prior informed consent of indigenous peoples. So to close up, we look forward for parties to implement this action plan. As civil society, we will continue to remind them of the importance of including human rights. Of course, as we also repeat, Action for Climate Empowerment is not a silo, so having an action plan is not enough. There are still many pending negotiations that really benefit from better integrating procedural rights in their decision, but also in the process that leads to such decisions. And we hear that in some negotiating rooms, observers' participation has been limited, so we really encourage parties to uphold their obligations to ensure effective participation, because eventually, as we say and we see, more effective and coherent action and decision will be taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. I do think that last point that Francesca raised is of additional value at the moment. Participation doesn't just happen at the national level. People need to be represented, countries need to be represented, civil society needs to be represented, and that has to happen at the decision-making tables at the national, regional, and international level. So that call remains strong, and that's backed up by countries' national and international obligations under law, as Shirley has mentioned. Now, Why is it that climate outreach is interested in this? Well, we're really hoping that governments take a really important and a careful look at how they put public engagement into their policy-making process, because ultimately that's what we want to change. So it's not just public policy about participation, but it's participatory approaches about policy-making. And it's really important. And it's because people cause climate change, people face the impacts of climate change, so it stands to reason that people should be part of the solution to deal with climate change. I'm just having a quick check of the time. I think what we'll do now is we'll open it up to any questions from the floor and journalists in particular. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. This was really enlightening. I'm speaking from the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. We're the global voice of the library field. And libraries at the national level and at the subnational level are actively implementing strategies across all 6 elements of ACE. And for our policy and advocacy work, we're very keen to build these relationships between these institutions that are carrying out this work and national level policymakers. And I wonder, do you have any idea or suggestion on the relationship between ACE focal points and national level stakeholders in civil society, and how we might be able to foster closer relations so these good practices are being heard and being amplified? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Is there a second question on the floor that we could take right away, or I'd be happy to start answering that? Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about how parties can be held to account on a couple of these elements of their legal obligations, so that just give us more information about what we can actually do to hold them accountable? Thank you.
All right. If it's all right, we'll start with those two. I'll have a quick stab at the first question in terms of supporting the implementation at the national level in partnership with ACE National Focal Points. I think what has been very clear through these negotiations over the past couple of years, both for the Glasgow Work Programme and its subsequent action plan, is that not a lot of national focal points on ACE have the capacity and or the resources to deliver on these plans that are coming out of these negotiations. So where civil society organizations, where federations such as the Library Federation can come in and actually transform their work, is to actively seek partnerships to then help them, to help the ACE National Focal Points deliver on some of their elements. And I would be hard-pressed to think that ACE Focal Points would reject this offer of support and partnership, their entire approach being participatory, of course. On the second question around legal obligations, I have 2 lawyers beside me, so I'm very gladly going to hand them over. If I can hand over to Francesca first, and then Shirley, if you can pick up after that.
Thank you. That's a very good question, and the answer is there are many institutions involved in really pushing states to uphold their obligations. As we've seen also from Shirley's presentation, there are binding treaties and conventions that establish parties' obligations to uphold this kind of procedural rights. We perhaps can mention the Escazú Agreement of the Aarhus Convention that are very much about environmental democracy, and they actually establish obligations not just at the national level, so to ensure that the right to participation, to access to information is ensured in environmental policy making, but actually they also establish obligations to uphold these procedural rights in international environmental fora, so very much about UNFCCC and other similar processes. Also, the human rights treaty bodies are a very effective way to keep countries on record and on track in implementing their obligations. What we see more and more is that the Committee of Civil and Political Rights, of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Committee of the Rights of Children, on elimination of discrimination against women, refer more and more to the Paris Agreement, to national determined contributions, and so hopefully having this action plan and the decision on ACE could be also referenced in their recommendations to states. And in this sense, talking about engagement and participation of civil society organizations, NGOs can provide information directly to these committees. So every time a party comes up for review before these committees, we can provide information on how they are or they are not implementing their obligations in terms of procedural rights. I'm happy to stop there, and I'm sure Shirley might want to complement.
Shirley, just to say you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
No, it was fairly comprehensive, so I don't have much to add except that, of course, states would not be able to be held into account on grounds of Article 12, mainly because of lack of enforcement mechanisms. But as Francesca was saying, as we found that those procedural obligations are being enforced at international, regional, and national levels, although not labeled as ACE. But when it comes to public participation and access to information, there are lots of legal avenues to be explored.
Thank you, Shirley. So yeah, basically that when countries adopt or agree to an international agreement, they have to absorb those laws into their national structures and therefore create, for example, an access to information law. And then at the national level, that allows citizens of that country to hold that government to account by holding the accountability mechanisms that are enshrined within that national law. Are there any other questions? We've got 2 minutes. Okay, seeing none, what I'll do is I will draw this to a close. I really thank you very much for attending. Our report is available on the Climate Outreach website. We encourage you to go and download it. We will also be here for the rest of COP27, so if there's anything we can support you with, please do come and speak to us, our amazing colleagues at CL and at DLA Piper. We thank you for your time and attention.
إنني وإذ أتطلع إلى استقبالكم من قمة المناخ 27 التي تستضيفها مصر في شرم الشيخ